welcome to episode 126 of Authors Afterword. On this podcast, I talk to an author about one, occasionally more, of their books in detail. And if you found yourself enjoying today's episode, do share it with your friends. So, I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is Michael Stewart, who is the author of a number of books and plays, and is the director of the Bronte Writing Centre in Haworth. We'll be talking today about his latest novel, which, to me, is a wonderful mix of the witch hunting of Stacey Thomas's The Revels and the period immersion and story of regular people of Elizabeth Fremantle's The Honey and the Sting. Michael's book, Blackwood Women, has three narratives in the mid-1600s. That of the last wolf in England, who is given a voice for us. That of an Irish girl called Cara, whose parents were murdered in England and who is trying to find safety for herself. And that of the men who are trying to kill both Cara and the wolf. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Charlie. Thanks for having me on.
It's brilliant to have you. I've so enjoyed reading your book. I'm really looking forward to this. Can you tell us the inspiration for this book? I think you've got one going back to 2016.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre, really. It doesn't connect at all with the book on one level, but it was the Brexit referendum. So in 2016, I was watching what was happening, basically, the way that the country was divided, not along traditional left and right wing routes, really. And I was looking back in history to a time when England was dividing in that way. And I went back to the Civil War in the 17th century. And I read particularly about two brothers who fought to the death. One was a parliamentarian, and the other one was a royalist. So they were on complete opposite sides of the argument, and they fought in battle to the death. And I just thought, this is an interesting analogue to kind of capture the zeitgeist. But as I got more interested then, I started to read about the 17th century, about the Civil War, and what was happening in that lacuna when Charles I was beheaded, and Cromwell effectively takes over, but he goes to Ireland and leaves the whole country in disarray. And that disarray, that world turned upside down, really became the inspiration for this book. I'd been thinking for a while about writing a book about the last wolf in England, the hunt for the last wolf in England. And I've been reading many, many things about this. In Scotland and in Wales and in Ireland, we can set a date for when the last wolf was hunted. In England, we can't. There are various stories that have been written and various accounts. In short, nobody knows. And that's a great thing for a novelist because it means you can make it up. But it seemed to me, some of the people who were writing about this and saying that the last wolf was hunted in the 15th century seemed implausible, because if you look at Scotland, the last wolf was hunted in the late 17th century. Well, in fact, into the 18th century, sorry. Now, wolves don't respect borders, and the north of England and where this book is set isn't that far from Scotland. A wolf can typically wander 50 miles in a day. So the idea that it would confine itself to Scotland and not walk across the border, and that it would respect that division, just seemed absurd, really. So I didn't think it was implausible to set this hunt for the last wolf in the middle of the 17th century. So I took writer's license, basically, and that's what I did.
Yeah, it seems convenient to say that with what you're saying about borders, very true. And it seems kind of convenient that, yeah, people are saying, oh, there's no more wolves. I suppose I'm just thinking about, like, the reason that people hunted wolves, I suppose, because people got to thinking they're scary. Obviously, we feel differently nowadays. We know better about them, and how this might have all came into that kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Letting people know.
Well, I was just going to add as well to say, at that time, and still now, in fact, there was a lot of discussion about the reintroduction of wolves in certain places. And of course, if you know much about this, there was a very successful reintroduction in America in Yellowstone Park some time ago now, which basically was an experiment, and nobody quite knew how things would work, because wolves had been extinct since the 19th century in America, hunted to extinction. And Yellowstone Park had become so nature depleted, it was basically a monoculture. And the solution seemed to be to reintroduce wolves. And lo and behold, within hardly any time at all, a few years, the entire ecosystem was rebooted. So that really fascinated me. And there's been some success in Europe. So in Spain, they reintroduced some wolves. Having said that, there's been a lot of controversy. I can't remember it was now, but quite a powerful politician in Spain had a child attacked by a wolf, which kind of comes into the story a little bit. So it isn't without controversy, and there has been discussion about reintroducing wolves here in Scotland. It hasn't happened yet, but there's certainly a lot of goodwill around that idea. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know. I mean, I lived in Sweden for some time where wolves are still extant. And there is a very divided opinion about wolves there.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to get around with people's ideas and stuff that would make it difficult. Yeah, I mean, you saying that to me, I think, oh goodness, if they do it in England, that's really going to change when we go into the countryside, at least until we kind of get an idea ourselves of what wolves are like. Supposedly they're a lot nicer than we've been taught. That would change things. I like going to the forest and I think, oh my goodness. Obviously, I think about horses. I have to worry about horses. I have to worry about the cows and potentially wolves, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't like being chased by horses or cows, then yeah, wolves may not be. Having said that, they're secretive. They're a secretive creature. Their nearest relative is the dog, but dogs are quite different, really. I mean, dogs are affable creatures. They're social creatures. They're very sort of easy to get along with, where wolves generally are secretive. They're shy animals. They've learned to be that way. So the idea that they would chase you, it's very, very unlikely, really. It's unlikely you'd even see them, to be honest with you.
That's, yeah, you're giving me loads of information as well that I didn't know. I knew that they were better than we thought they were, Even today, I know there's TV adverts and stuff that show people being chased by wolves. I would like to ask you, you've got these different narratives, and I wanted to ask you why you wanted these different narratives, like what it brought to the story for you as such, and in the way of creation and what it allowed you to do.
There's three main narrative voices and three main sections which alternate. So you've got the wolf, the last wolf in England, who has her own chapters, her own sections, and that's alternated with Cara's story. So Cara is a 13-year-old girl who's of Irish origin. She's travelled from Ireland when she was younger with her family to flee persecution in Ireland, and they come to Yorkshire to basically hide out and disguise the fact that they're Irish. But somebody finds out, and the central antagonist in the story, Lemuel Lane, is an anti-Catholic zealot. And he hates Irish and he hates Catholics. He likens them to witches. And that was a prevailing view at the time, that papacy and witchcraft were essentially the same thing. So the idea is that the last wolf, I should say, is a she-wolf, and she's been hunted by the same people that are hunting Cara. So the idea is that the wolf's narrative and Cara's narrative some way are connected and follow the same trajectory, and in doing so hopefully amplify each other's themes and so on. So that's the idea, really. It's that narrative technique of having two stories that explore the same theme. I mean, Shakespeare does it all the time, doesn't he? You'll have an A story and a B story, and the B story will be another version of the A story, and it'll explore the same themes in a different way.
Yeah, no, I loved what you did with that. I thought it was great. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there's obviously various different routes we can go down. I'm going to take one first. Can you tell us more about Cara and her family and the situation for Irish people at the time?
Probably, unless you're really into this side of history, this will be new to lots of people. So in 1641, there was a rebellion. Phelim O'Neill was the leader of this, but there was lots of people involved. In 1641, the indigenous Irish population, the Catholic population, had no rights, basically. They had no seat in Parliament. They were second-class citizens. This is something that goes back to the 12th century, so I won't go into the full history, but essentially it reached a point in history when the frustration and the anger of this injustice led to the rebellion that Phelim O'Neill and his people thought would be a quick coup d'etat. They thought they'd take Dublin, basically overpower the Parliament, restore some sort of justice, and that would be it. In fact, it didn't work out at all. It was a very, very bloody and long-lasting skirmish, really, which resulted in 1649. So Charles I is beheaded in January 1649, and Cromwell is placed as sort of acting head. Almost immediately, within a few months of this, he goes over to Ireland to settle scores, really, and absolutely butchers hundreds of thousands of Irish people, imprisons them, enslaves them, sends them off to Jamaica, to the plantations in the West Indies, to be slaves, essentially, and kills lots and lots of others. So it's a very, very violent period in history. And that's really where the family begin. So her father, Cara's father, has helped out a Protestant. They are Irish Catholic themselves, but they've become friendly with someone and they help him out, and they're persecuted for doing so. And as a thank you, he gives them some land in Yorkshire, which is how they end up to be in Yorkshire. So, but that's the backstory. You don't actually see that story. That's kind of what informs Kara's attitude and feeling. And as I mentioned before, really, there was a lot of anti-Irish sentiment. Catholicism was really seen as sorcery. There was a huge amount of persecution, really, across the country, not just in the north. So that's the kind of the backset, if you like. That's the kind of world that they enter. They've gone from the frying pan into the fire, in essence.
Something that I noted is that throughout the book, obviously, Cara is running and she's running away. And even at the end, she's still got a journey to go on. And I think it's interesting you do leave it there, because I was wondering throughout the book if we were going to see this safe place that her father talked about. And I think it's really interesting that you do keep that thread where she does pause and has safety for a little bit, or at least she feels so. And then she is still kind of running at the end, although there's a bit of positivity there. Yeah.
Well, I should say that within this kind of backdrop of chaos, essentially, there isn't really a parliament. There's a general sense of lawlessness, which is particularly felt in the north. What happens is, as with any disaster, really, people exploit it. And there's been persecution of witchcraft before this, so this isn't a new thing. But what happens in this lacuna in 1649, where basically the law's removed, is it allows people like Matthew Hopkins, for example, lots and lots of self-appointed, always men, who are self-appointed, they're not qualified, they're not given any title, they give this themselves, and they go out from town to town and basically accuse women of witchcraft for money, make lots of money from this. So that's going on. But also at this time, you've got lots of radical groups, dissenting groups. You've got the Levellers and the Diggers and the Ranters and the Quakers and the Fifth Monarchists and a Family of Love and so many others. And they're revisioning the future of England in a very radical way, saying things like, we don't need parliament, we don't need money, we don't need marriage, we can have free love, we can live off the land. Winstanley, who was the leader of the Diggers, basically said, this land is our land. We have a right to take it back. The Norman conquest, which basically carved up this country and gave it to his favoured people who became the lords of this land, is a theft, and we should take it back. So it was a very radical time. And the safe place you're alluding to, there were places where people like Winstanley were trying out these radical, I guess, communes, really. Places where you could live without hierarchy, without religion, without the shackles of the society at the time. Almost you could say it was a bit like the 60s in a way. These were like 17th century hippies in many ways.
Can you tell us more about how it worked?
Well, like any utopia, it's the prelude to dystopia, isn't it, often? So these things worked only briefly. There were a few that seemed to do well. Of course, there are reasons why they failed, and it's not always to do with the thing itself. It's often to do with outside forces, and that's really what happened. So when order was restored and Cromwell comes back from Ireland, and he's a terrible, tyrannical leader, he's actually worse than Charles I. So they've got rid of one devil and replaced him with the worst devil. They bring Charles II, Charles' son, back from the Netherlands, where he's basically ran off in fear of his life. They bring him back in 1660 and reimpose the monarchy. So all this radicalness and these alternative societies are kind of disbanded, really, and attacked and broken down. And we go back to business. We go back to a monarchist system as we did before. And all those radical ideas, I wouldn't say they disappear, because I think there are still traces of them. If you think about the Quaker movement, I know they're not as radical as they were in the 17th century, but they're still pacifists, most of them. Lots of them believe in things like vegetarianism or veganism. So some of those radical ideas still exist in our society, but they've been kind of shunted in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I was very surprised when you wrote it. I actually thought first that it was something you'd completely created that was fictional. And it's very interesting that, I love history and I like that period of history. And I've studied the New Model Army way back when.
Yeah.
And I'd never heard of this kind of thing at all, which is fascinating. It's the kind of thing you'd think that people would want to talk more about and bring to the public consciousness. And I'm literally finding about it just the first time in your book.
It's interesting, isn't it? But I think it's because it's social history. And I think, if you look at the way the history is taught and the way that history is written about and the way that the media reports it and so on, it's always kings and queens and the powerful. It's about battles between leaders and so on. It's very rarely about ordinary people.
Yeah.
about the labourers and the farm workers and the weavers and the crafts guilds. And those stories never get told, really. To an extent, it's understandable because many of those people were illiterate. They didn't write the histories down. There's no record of it. So it's much harder to tell those stories. But there are records and there are certain accounts. So it's not entirely true to say that it doesn't exist. But I think there is a prejudice, really, in the genre of history.
Yeah, I suppose in some ways people might say, well, it's not so exciting. There isn't the amazing dresses. You can't get anything like a Bridgerton or something out of it, you know. But yeah, no, I mean, something that you're making me think of that I did want to bring up, I think it is partly due to what you're focusing on. I really did find your book just so immersive to the point that I was reading the book and I thought, oh, I might have read 10 pages since I last picked it up. And I look back and I'm like 30 pages, 40 pages. You know, I was really just totally invested in it. And I wanted to ask you, how did you go about making this book and effectively your fictionalization of this real world? How did you go about making it so real?
I was very lucky in one sense, because what happened just before lockdown, so this is probably about February 2020, and I'd wanted to try this out for a long time. I had some time. Most of my books have been written really when I've been juggling lots of different types of work. So I had this 6-month period where essentially I had a sabbatical. And I decided I would do things differently. I'd always had this idea. I wanted to take over a large space and create, if you imagine something like a crime incident room. You know, when you see a detective show on telly and there's the detective there surrounded by a big map of London, let's say, and there's all the suspects, photographs of them, and then there's bits of string leading them to where they're living, and there's all this kind of information all spread out on the walls of the room. I basically wanted to do that. So that's what I did. I hired a huge room in an art centre near where I lived at the time. And it was a big pitch roof, huge place. And I drew maps. I made these maps. I drew them very large. I put them on the walls and I drew pictures of the characters and their backstories. What I did as well is I immersed myself in the 16th and 17th century predominantly, the folklore and the folk traditions, and I was pulling out different phrases and different quotes and things like that, and I was sticking those all over the walls, and I had a glossary of terms. I had different timelines because the 3 different narratives we talked about, I wanted to make sure that when Cara was here, the wolf was there and Lemuel was here, and I knew where everybody was at any one point because it's schematically in 2 sections, and the first section is 7 days in November, and then we have a break of a month, and then we have 7 days in December. So there's 2 halves to the book, basically. And I wanted to make sure that timeline worked for all 3 different timelines. So I had all that spread out. And basically, I got these wallpaper tables, those big long tables, like banquet tables, and I laid them all out, and I spread books and maps and all kinds of things all over, essentially immersed myself in this world for 6 months. And that's how I wrote the first draft. And I didn't realise, but within 2 weeks of me setting this up, we went into lockdown and I had the entire art centre to myself because they locked it up for 6 months. So I'd go down there at 9 o'clock in the morning and I would be completely uninterrupted till 5 when I came home. And I had a kettle there and I'd take some sandwiches. But essentially, I was just completely left alone to immerse myself in this world.
I can see how that works. Yeah, your body was obviously in the building, and then your entire mind was just there without any disruptions. Wow. Okay. And I'm going to ask you, have mentioned the language there a little bit, and I would like to ask you about that because I found your language really interesting. It seemed to me often, because I was going from one to the other, and then I kind of came to a conclusion about a kind of middle case, because sometimes you've got a kind of oldie worldy language. Sometimes you've got dialogue and things that seems very, very modern, but also kind of seems like it could be very much true to the time. And I just wanted to ask you how you went about the language part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I did read a lot of writing from that period and I cherry-picked. I took certain words that I thought, I like the colour, I like the texture of that word. What I didn't want to do is I didn't want to completely immerse people in that language because it would be very difficult to read apart from anything else. It would be a chore.
Yeah.
So it's written in a modern style, but it does include certain words that are associated with that time, which we don't use anymore. And what I tried to do is place them in such a way, in a gradual way, so that you weren't confused or discombobulated and that the context of the word would make it clear. Even if you didn't quite know what the word meant, you'd be able to have a really good guess and be fairly accurate. So that was the kind of idea. So I basically peppered it in quite a gradual way with some of these words, rather than kind of bombarding people with them. I wanted to sort of give people a flavour of the language of the time without it becoming a chore for them to read, in essence. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'd definitely say you're successful with what you've gone about. Yeah, no, it's really nice. The modernness of it does help you feel there, because then you're able to relate to them at the same time. I think you used the phrase in the book, out of the frying pan into the fire, or something to that effect, and you used it earlier. That was one I picked up that, to me, first I thought, oh, I've heard it loads, it's a modern one. But then at the same time I thought, well, it could well be historical, because it still fits.
I think I'm trying to remember. It was something like, it's out of the skillet into the... I did change it. I said it's something like, it's out of the skillet into the stove or something. I can't remember, but yes, it was a version of that phrase, yeah. And Shakespeare's a great resource. Lots of words were coined by Shakespeare. I don't know for sure, but were first used, I should say, by Shakespeare, which are still around today and sound incredibly modern. But certain things we don't use anymore, and they sound comically kind of old-fashioned, So there are sources there and ways of kind of getting this stuff. And it's also fun. I just enjoy doing it, really.
I want to take us back a bit, because you were talking about witchcraft and I want to go into that more. I really was interested and just enjoyed how you went about... There's a big thread, or at least I certainly thought it was a big thread, with the witch hunting, where you're discussing women being betrayed by their neighbours. I believe Kate goes into it a little bit, that sort of thing. And it's something that often people touch on, but you did really kind of include it. Can you talk more about, I suppose, including it and this kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I read and had read before I even began writing this, lots of books, lots of novels set in this era featuring witches or women accused of witchcraft. And I didn't like a lot of them, really. And I felt that the way that witches were constructed, I found it a little bit stereotypical, really. And I wanted my witches to be, well, authentic from my perspective, i.e. avoid all of the stereotypes and cliches that we've seen before. So my witches are more like, I guess, a form of paganism, which is closer to mysticism, really, or pantheism. So that sort of idea, going back to a pre-Christian culture, a heathen culture, basically. So that was my idea. And to have them, genuinely be a bit edgy, really, and they take potions, but they're not Eye of Newton, Tongue of Frog, and that kind of thing. They're genuinely mind-altering psychedelic plants. So Alice, who's the leader of the cult, concocts things from woodland botanical ingredients that are genuinely mind-altering substances, psychedelic substances. And I hadn't really seen that done before, really. And it just made sense to me that if you're wanting to convince people you had magical powers, that would be a very easy way to do it, really. If somebody's tripping, they become very susceptible. And Charles Manson did this, didn't he, in the 60s? He convinced his cult, the family as it was called, that he was a messiah figure just by giving them loads of LSD, essentially. And that's what Alice is doing to her girls.
Yeah, no, I did find it interesting that you did have that kind of magic witchness in there. And I wanted to ask, actually, you had written about ravens in a previous novel, and I've noted that down because, of course, you've got ravens here. I just wanted to ask about the raven, about that in the context of the novel, and if you have an interest in particular in ravens, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, I am. I'm a passionate bird watcher, full stop. I love all birds, but I have a particular love of ravens. My first literary love, the first writer that really turned me on, really, when I was almost 11, I was just turning 11, was a writer called Edgar Allan Poe. And if you know him, you'll know probably his most famous poem is called The Raven. It's a very long poem. So I've had an interest in ravens a long time before I ever saw one. The first time I saw ravens was the Tower of London, where they're kept. In fact, there's a raven master who looks after them. It's his job. So I didn't see them in the wild to begin with, because ravens have been hunted to extinction pretty much all over England until fairly recently. I note with great pleasure, I saw for the first time some ravens in Yorkshire about 2 or 3 years ago, a place called Whernside, which is a big hill in North Yorkshire. And I saw 2 juvenile ravens flying close to the hill. And that's the first time I've seen ravens in Yorkshire. So they are coming back. That's the good news. I remember the BTO, the British Trust of Ornithology, and they produce statistics. It's bad news for almost all birds, but ravens are starting to encroach again in England. But in King Crow, my first novel, the book was written in 2009. It was published in 2011, but I wrote it in 2009. And the only place in England then was Cumbria. So there were some ravens in Cumbria, but other than that, you'd have to go to Scotland or to Wales to see ravens. So this is what Cooper does, the protagonist in the book. He goes to Cumbria, to Helvellyn, in fact, where there's a very established eyrie. We call ravens' nests the same as we call eagles' nests, their eyries. And they're often 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, and they return to them, and different generations. So the siblings of ravens will return to that nest, and their siblings, and so on. So they have a kind of culture, if you like, and a history. I'm just interested in birds altogether, but particularly corvids. So corvids have always excited me. When I was a kid, crows, rooks, jackdaws, magpies, those birds, jays, all of the corvids that I could see around me, because I grew up in Salford. It's in a very urban place. It wasn't really a place associated with birds, but there were lots of corvids. And of course, if you know your corvids, the raven is the king. It's called King Crow. Yeah, it's the king. Its Latin name is Corvus Rex. So it is the king, and it's much bigger than a crow. And a carrion crow is the second biggest corvid, but a raven is almost twice the size of it, and its bill is twice the size. And it behaves quite differently. Crows gather in groups, where ravens normally just in pairs, and they pair for life. When ravens get together, they pair for life. That's a monogamous relationship. And they're very, very intelligent birds. Markedly so. They're problem solvers. They've done all kinds of cognitive tests with them, and they're essentially equivalent to chimpanzees and dolphins and the other higher category. We're in that band, by the way. So the higher category of intelligence includes ourselves, dolphins, elephants, other simians such as chimpanzees, but also ravens. So that's partly my interest, but also it's the mythology and the folklore of the raven. So Odin, we know, had a pair of ravens that were his minions. But also ravens for many, many years have been omens of doom. They've also been associated with witchcraft. If you know about witchcraft and the idea of witchcraft, the notion of the familiar, that a witch would have an animal familiar, that they would work together. To have a raven would be like the ultimate familiar, in essence. Charles Dickens had a raven, for example. So in Victorian societies, they were kept as pets, and they learned to talk. Poe had a raven as a pet as well. In Poe's poem, The Raven quoths nevermore. And people taught ravens to speak in the way that we teach parrots to speak. So they're just, I will shut up about ravens in a sec, but they're just absolutely fascinating creatures, I think. They also live much longer than other corvids. So they can live 30, 40, 50 years, which is very long, isn't it, for any bird, really?
Yeah. No, previously I knew about parrots, and that's about it. I knew they were very intelligent, but I didn't know they were quite on the level that you've said, with us and elephants, etc. So yeah, we definitely need to give them far more respect than we have.
It's really sad, isn't it? Because, I use them as a symbol in King Crow, as a symbol of the outcast, of being excluded, and that's pretty much what's happened, really. They were once loved. There was, I forget which king it was now, but there was a kind of price on their head, and then that's how they were hunted out of extinction, because people used to hunt and kill ravens for money. They were given money by the state to do so. So they're also have been incredibly persecuted animals.
Yeah. This has been a really interesting conversation. I wish we could talk more about the ravens, but I'm going to have to bring us back as well, though. There's so much in your novel to talk about that we've completely skipped over the male narrative, I think. I suppose I do need to bring that in. Can you tell us more about, I suppose, Lemuel Lane, Johann Hellstrom, I think you'd pronounce it as, which I think is fascinating because you said earlier that you have lived in Sweden, so that answers the question of why he's in there. And also, definitely, Gad and Ezekiel. Can you just tell us about them and including them, etc.?
Yeah, so Lemuel Lane is a very powerful man. He fought alongside Cromwell in the Civil War, and was very successful as a soldier, and he was rewarded. He's a zealot. He's a Protestant zealot. He's a Roundhead, believes in the Protestant cause, very much against Catholicism and sorcery of any sort. What happens early on in the book is he has only one son. He has two daughters and one son, and his son goes missing, and they find his son, and he's been attacked. And they don't know at this point quite what's happened, but it turns out he's been attacked by the last wolf in England. He's been bitten. And he bleeds to death as a consequence of this injury. And this sends Lemuel into an apoplexy and a rage and so on. And he puts a price on this wolf's head. of a ridiculous sum of money, such a high amount of money, that what it does is it brings in every psychopath you can imagine, really. First, locally, and Gad and Ezekiel are the first, really, of these wolf hunters, and they're very, very incompetent wolf hunters. They're more like Laurel and Hardy or something. They're a kind of comedy double act. They're completely incompetent, but they very much want to get this wolf and get the money. But then they're competing with more experienced people who come in from other places in Yorkshire and then from across the country. And eventually what happens in the second half of the book is Lemuel gets so frustrated because no one can catch this wolf, and they try everything. He hires in the end a wolf hunter from Sweden called Johann Hellstrom. And Hellstrom is famous for killing 500 wolves. You know, he's just this kind of legendary figure, really. Even before we meet him, he's this legendary figure. You know, the phrase, "you shouldn't summon a power you can't control." This is what happens. So Hellstrom comes into the book to catch the wolf. It's a bit like the woman who swallowed the fly and then eats the spider. You know, what it does, it catapults the narrative, basically. What he doesn't realize is that Hellstrom, yes, is a very competent wolf hunter, and he will probably catch this wolf, but he's also a force of complete chaos. And he's a bit of a trickster character, and he's a completely unreliable, amoral figure who seems to operate entirely on his own level, really, and is trouble, probably more trouble than the wolf is. So Lemuel has basically summoned this demon, really. And yeah, he comes from Sweden, and you're right, I did live in Sweden for a time. If you know anything about Sweden, you know, if you had a certain size or a certain amount of land, legally you had to hunt wolves. You had to have a wolf pit on your land. And the wolf pit had to be so many meters in depth and width. The criteria was very specific. And there were wolf hunts, and these would happen on a regular basis, and they would involve the whole village. And there were routinely prices on wolves' heads, and that happened for hundreds of years. When he comes into it, we've just gone through, or still going through a civil war, I should say. Well, there's been a war in Sweden, and that's just a similar stage, really. So there's also a kind of analogue between what's happening in Sweden, the history of warfare in Sweden, and in England. But of course, we've lost all our skills of hunting wolves by this point, because there hasn't been any for generations. So that folk knowledge, if you like, has died out. So really, the Lemuel Lane chapters are the antagonist chapters, if you like. Those are the forces of opposition. I should give a shout out, actually, to one of my girlfriends. So when I was 18, I had a girlfriend called Anna Weiberg, a Swedish girlfriend who I met in Manchester, in fact, in a club next to the Hacienda, if people know that place. And she was an au pair in Manchester, and she went back to Sweden. And I was out of work at the time, and I basically went with her, and I lived in Sweden with her and learnt something of the wolves there. But as I was writing this book, I got back in touch with her because I hadn't spoken to her for, 30-something years. So I got back in touch with her just to check some of the names, the Swedish names for certain things. And so we're back in touch, actually. In fact, she gets a mention in the acknowledgements of the book. So I was fortunate in a sense that I had a Swedish person who knew something about this that I could tap up for information.
Well, something I thought was interesting on Hellstrom is that you've used the word, I think you said psychosis, effectively, or psycho. And it really interested me that you have the book all about witchcraft, women are witches, and then one interpretation you could make of the end is that Hellstrom is kind of a witch in himself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the ironies, isn't it? The women who have been accused of this thing are being hunted by someone who probably genuinely is that thing. You know? And it's the same with someone like Matthew Hopkins. I mean, he was a psychotic character. He was an absolutely vile man. You go back to Heinrich Kramer, the guy who wrote Malleus Maleficarum, the first witch hunt manual, which kind of instigated the whole witch hunt cult, if you like, in the medieval era. If you read about him, he was an absolute psychopath, you know. So these men who are accusing women of being evil are themselves that thing. They are the evil. So that irony is deliberate, you know.
Yeah, I did wonder. I mean, you've got Ezekiel at the end, and you have had Kate talking about what she has been, that I mentioned earlier, and you've got this part where Ezekiel is effectively questioning everything at the end. And I suppose I want to ask, like, in general, why was that important to add? And I suppose also, was there any sort of drawing from history that came into your decision to do that?
Well, very much with Ezekiel, I set him up as a bit of a comic character, really, him and Gad. They're meant to be the kind of the release from some of the tension in the book. It's quite a dark book in some ways, and I thought it needed some lighter sort of narrative. So the idea of these two workers who work for Lemuel is to bring in some of that comedy and some of that lightness, if you like. But also wanted to show that they can change and develop. They're not just a comic kind of one-dimensional device. So the idea that Ezekiel is not entirely an idiot and actually has got a very intelligent wife. And it's the influence of that intelligent wife that actually gets him to question the values that are around him. The values being some of the biblical thing that's being preached, but also, more importantly to this, the idea that these women were witches, and he actually listens to his wife and realizes she's probably right. And this was a time when working class people were starting to question authority and learning to read the Bible themselves and saying, we don't need a minister. We don't need somebody to interpret this for ourselves. If we learn to read this for ourselves, we can understand it from the source. And they realized that they were basically being hoodwinked and people were wrongly representing things in the Bible in order to exploit them. And movements like the Quakers, for example, and the Methodist movement and so on, they came about through working class culture. Working class people basically becoming literate and questioning authority. So on one level, Ezekiel is standing in for that person.
Well, I suppose they're kind of bad guys, but I agree with you. They weren't awful bad guys. They were part of that group, but on their own, no, they were nice people in many ways. Can you tell us more about your using inclusion of the Fens? Because if I remember rightly, there were Fens, but then they were changed. They were dismantled effectively, for want of a better word. Can you tell us about including them in the history and stuff?
Yeah, so I didn't know there were Fens in Yorkshire, actually. And it's a book by, I'll get his name right, Ian D. Rotherham. It's called Yorkshire's Forgotten Fenland. And I came across this book sometime before I wrote Blackwood Women, and I'd always assumed the Fens were something down south until I came across this book. And I think it is the only book, actually, that's been written about it. But it's very well written. It's very assiduously researched. And there were Fens up until they were drained in the late 17th century in Yorkshire. And they were vast, they were extensive, they were 50 miles across in places. And they were lawless to an extent because they were impassable. The land itself was owned, but kind of neglected. And people that owned it just sort of pretended it wasn't theirs, really, because the hassle of dealing with it. So what that then allowed was people to live there in a state of anarchy, really. And they were called water gypsies. They lived on the water. They hunted and lived off the land, So when I was thinking about Alice and this commune, this cult, basically all these women have been accused of witchcraft and come together and have found a place in a forest where they're safe, essentially. They're hiding out. And I was thinking, well, where would that be, really? And I thought, forests are good places, but I think it'd be even better if there was almost like a castle has a moat, if you like. That was what I was thinking. In medieval, or even early the medieval culture, if you're vulnerable, you build something with a moat or some way of protecting yourself. So I thought this is a natural moat. If they place themselves in the midst of this fenland, they would kind of be able to kind of operate a clandestine society. So that's really where it came about. And then, of course, it is linked to Charles II, because when Charles II comes back from the Netherlands, he brings back the engineers from the Netherlands who have pioneered the draining of waterlands. If you think about the Netherlands, they pioneered this technique of taking wetlands and draining them and making them arable. So they brought this technology back. And Charles famously did this in East Anglia and around that sort of area, but also drained the fens of Yorkshire. It was to do with money. If you drain a fenland, suddenly it becomes, more valuable, really.
Yeah. Talking of Alice, can you tell us more about her in terms of her herself? And also, I would actually really like to hear more from you about this whole aspect of effectively the end of that group of people where they've taken the potion and we don't really hear, from Alice, what her decisions were. We can see them from what Cara experiences. Can you talk more about this?
So Alice is much older than the girls. There's 6 girls who range from, Cara's the youngest actually at 13, up to late teens. Alice is not really given an age, but she's around 40ish, something like that. She's got much more of a past, much more of a history. She doesn't speak like them. They're all working class girls, basically, mostly from the north of England. So they kind of share that culture where Alice has come from somewhere completely different. Her accent isn't recognisable to Cara, so we don't really know what that means, whether she's come from another country or whether another part of England. But she speaks quite differently to them, far more educated. In my mind, her background, her family were of the cult, the family of love. And the family of love started in Germany in the 16th century, so a little bit earlier. But it was a cult that spread across Europe. It was a cult which basically said, let's get rid of religion, let's get rid of possessions, let's get rid of hierarchies, let's get rid of marriages. They believed in free love. They believed in vegetarianism, so quite a modern sensibility, really. In fact, where we are now in lots of ways. So in my mind, Alice's parents were a family of love cultists who had been persecuted. She herself is accused of witchcraft. She's hanged, but the rope breaks, and I think it was actually written into law at that point. If not, it was certainly accepted that if that happened, it was God's blessing and you were given grace and you were essentially free. But that's traumatized. She still has the scar around her neck. And she's become a different kind of zealot, if you like. So Lemuel's a zealot on one side of the equation. I was thinking about lots of these cults. We talked about Charles Manson, but I was also thinking of Jim Jones and David Koreshi and, well, so many of them. In fact, all of them. If you look at any cult, they have a particular narrative, which you have a charismatic leader who provides an alternative to the status quo. And it seems to be a utopia and a freer and fairer world. And everybody buys into it and become almost brainwashed into this value system. But what happens is that cult leader becomes unable to sustain that delusion and people start to question it. And what that cult leader has to do then is go to further and further extremes to maintain that delusion. Essentially, what they're trying to do is they're trying to maintain power and go into further and further extremes to do so. So Alice is kind of based on pretty much any cult leader, really. They all are versions of each other.
I wasn't sure where that thread was going. And I was actually quite surprised when we hear of her running out when she's inflamed as such and towards the men. That was a surprise to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's meant to be shocking, and it certainly brings things to a close. You see, it's also linked to, because one of the big themes in the book, really, which we've not really had a chance to talk about, is the ecology. Because I'm writing this book about the 17th century, but what I'm really writing about is what's happening now. We're actually at the end point of the sixth mass extinction. This is the first mass extinction that is Anthropocene. In other words, it's a human-induced extinction. We've killed over 90% of everything that's ever lived on this planet. And we've done that within my lifetime, pretty much. And that's shocking, the extent of that. And what's more shocking is that we're not talking about it all the time or doing anything about it. We really are fiddling with our own burns. So we're in a position now where almost everything that lives has been destroyed and nobody seems to really care. So that scene at the end that you're alluding to with the forest on fire, and that includes Alice because she's kind of part of that, is my way of saying, look, this is what's happening now, actually. Our forest is on fire as well, and we need to reflect on that, really, and do something about it.
So that is kind of your message. That obviously there's lots of different things in the book, but that's an important message you're leaving us with, yeah.
Well, I'm trying to say, look, it feels a little bit hopeless. It does feel like we're at the end point and there isn't a way back, but nature's incredibly resilient. It isn't inevitable. Extinction isn't inevitable. So, yeah, we've got challenges and we need to radically change pretty much everything. But we've done that in the past. There have been points in our history where we have changed our values almost overnight. So it may seem kind of a bit cuckoo at the moment to think that can happen. And this may sound strange, but I'm actually quite optimistic. I think we can change. But it doesn't look like that, does it, from where we're standing?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you are making me think. I know I've brought this up during the pandemic when it happened, but of course we had that time when we saw these wonderful images of nature and animals reclaiming our cities, didn't we? During the lockdown.
Yeah. And I think that apocalypses have always been here. We've always felt like, or certain people in society have always felt like it's the end of the world, and we're still standing now. That doesn't mean that this one isn't going to be different. So, yeah, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? But hopefully people will get more active, and there are things we can do. The system we've got now that we vote somebody out every 4 years, it's localized, and the kind of problems we're facing are global, and that's the main issue we've got to get over, I think, is to do with the way that things are governed. That power is local, and unless we come together, it's just not going to happen, is it?
I agree. If anyone is interested, obviously we can't continue on a subject, but Michael has written a book about what's it called? The Wilderness?
Oh, Walking the Invisible. Yeah, Walking the Invisible, which is a hybrid memoir, yeah, which is a nature book, yeah, where I walk through the landscapes, yeah.
One thing, actually, that I did want to ask you. You've obviously got, as we said, lots of darkness in this book, and you have said how Ezekiel and Gad kind of break that up. Is it difficult doing this kind of book and having so much darkness in it and being aware that it's quite heavy as such, I suppose?
I mean, Graham Greene said this, didn't he? He said a writer has to have a shard of ice in his heart, And I think what he meant really is what we do as writers is we construct worlds to make our characters suffer, which seems like a really bizarre thing to do. And that's what creates the drama. So that's a necessary job of any writer. But it's an odd thing to do because obviously you care about your characters and you fall in love with them as a writer, and then you torture them. So it's a very strange position to be in. I've never quite been able to square the circle, but I think it's something to do with, no matter how dark a story is, in some way it enriches you. And I believe that when you read a good book and you engage with a good book, you attach yourself vicariously to the protagonist in a way that you have deep empathy, in the sense that you become that character and you're living the world through their eyes. And you're able to experience things that you wouldn't want to experience in real life, life-endangering situations. Now, in real life, we would run away from those situations. We're deeply conservative. And I'm not talking about politics. I'm just talking about our behaviour. We walk through a door, not the window. It might be more fun to swing through the window, but we walk through a door. So we generally, most of us, take very conservative choices. And we're kind of trapped by that in a way. And I think one of the things that books allow us to do is to break out of that paradigm, essentially, and fully experience, and it sounds paradoxical, fully experience the world, even though that world is a constructed world. It's a paradox, I think, essentially. And I think that's what we're trying to do. So the dark stuff, when I'm reading that and writing that, it's the same thing in a way. I'm trying to immerse myself as a writer, and I'm trying to immerse myself as a reader. And yes, it's dark, but it's exciting and it's fun and it's interesting and it's propulsive. The thing about our lives is they're not propulsive. We tend to be habitual. We get up at the same time in the morning, probably have something very similar for breakfast every day, either go to work or education or volunteer somewhere or do something, come back, have an evening meal that's probably the same or similar to the, watch a bit of telly or read a book or whatever, and then go to bed. And that's it, isn't it? 90% of our lives are entirely on a treadmill. And it's safe and completely understandable that people want to live like that. But also there's this yearning in us to have a richer, more psychologically kind of involved life. And that's what stories give us, I think.
Yeah, it's odd almost. Well, I feel it's odd. It probably isn't, but it feels odd at the time that a book that can be so realistic and, dare I say, like, violent. There's so much violence in your book. There's so much horror. But that is the stuff that really can keep your interest. You're pulled into it, and because you're so pulled into it, you do kind of emphasise, as you said, and it helps you work out different things in life, if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't know where I'm going with this, actually, but I just found that interesting. I'm thinking of other books that are really quite and have also pulled me in and really affected me, but in a good way at the end, and made me think. Yeah.
Well, I think, and I teach this as well, Robert McKee said that the job of a writer is to put your protagonist under pressure, the most pressure you can, in order to reveal true character. And that's the important thing, to reveal true character, because an habitual life doesn't reveal true character. And I think that's why there's so many shows on TV where you put people under pressure, you take them to a jungle or you do something with them to reveal something, to make them express themselves or do something, which we then go, that's who you really are. And I think as people, we can only really learn about ourselves by putting ourselves under pressure, but we can't genuinely do that. We can't genuinely go out and fight Lemuel Lane or run away from a wolf or whatever the thing is. That's too dangerous. So this is one of the values about books and stories in general, I think, is it allows us to have a sense of who we really are outside of that prison, if you like, a self-imposed schema that we're kind of built around ourselves to protect ourselves, is actually not allowing us to see who we really are.
It's almost on a getting towards a spiritual thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it is. I think narrative, if you look at the Bible and another religious text, they're essentially stories, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're stories that we tell each other because they have a wider purpose and to teach us in some way something higher than the mundane world that surrounds us.
That's very, very true. So I'm going to have to ask about what's next.
So I've just finished a book. In fact, it's with my editor now, and I'm in that weird position where I'm waiting for her to get back to me, which, I'm quite patient, but not that patient. So it's another novel, a historical novel. It's called Surrounded by My Enemies. It's set in 1887 in Salford and Manchester, where I'm from. And most people probably don't realise that in 1887, Buffalo Bill brought his Wild West show to Salford. It was there for 5 months. During that time, there was a Sioux Indian called Surrounded by the Enemy. That was his name. He was 6'7". Imagine that in Salford in the 19th century, where the average height of a man was 5'2". And in real life, his body went missing. He died at 27. His body went missing. So I've taken some of the facts. There was a detective called Jerome Caminada around at that time, who was a very ingenious detective, said to be the influence on Arthur Conan Doyle's construction of Sherlock Holmes. And he solved lots of unsolvable crimes, and he wrote his memoirs, and he was very well known at the time, although forgotten about now, very well known at the time. So it's a detective story, and Surrounded by the Enemy is accused of killing a girl, and he goes on the run, and the detective Caminada is in search of him. But the backdrop is the crime happens in a place called Angel Meadow, which, again, I don't know if people know about this, but it was the most notorious crime-ridden area in Europe. There's a square mile in Manchester where there were more murders per capita than Whitechapel or 5 Points in New York. It was an absolute cesspit. And that's where it all takes place. And at the same time, historically, what was happening in Manchester is there were gangs called the Scuttlers. At that time, there were 26 gangs, collectively known as the Scuttlers. And they were very, very violent youth gangs who were battling against each other and killing each other and so on. And Jerome Caminada he's put a lot of these people in prison, and they've come back out of prison again, and they all want him dead. So he's surrounded by his enemies, surrounded by the enemies, surrounded by his enemies. And pretty much every character in the book is surrounded by their enemies in some way or another.
Okay. How many narratives have you got in this book? It sounds like it could be quite complex.
Well, there's Caminada's story. There is the girl who goes missing, her story. That's quite brief. You've got the Sioux, surrounded by the enemy, his story. So the novel is fictional, but it is based on historical events.
I hope that it gets edited, etc., and we see a release date. Thank you, Michael, for coming today. This has been amazing. I don't think this book is leaving my head anytime soon. Thank you for coming on the show and for talking about it.
Oh, thank you, Charlie. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Do join me next time. And if you have a moment to spare, please do leave a rating and/or review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Podcast Addict. Thank you. Authors Afterword, episode 126, was recorded on the 14th of April and published on the 11th of August, 2025. Music and production by Charlie Place.